Now you four have to understand that Doomcat is not like you, Maud said, as she took them down an overgrown walkway towards another inner gate. What do you mean, Miss Shaden? Dylan asked, as he tried to comprehend the story that Barb had hastily summarized as they crossed onto the grounds of the compound. Well, you have to realize that you began as humans and slowly transformed into something else. Doomcat originally was an animal who has been gradually becoming more human-like due to the influence of Chris's spirit. He can't speak, and he is in many ways still an animal. Somewhere ahead on the other side of a tall fence, they could hear a rooster crowing just as the sky began to lighten with dawn. All four wondered with excited hope if they would actually see the sun. Bill gazed to the west and felt his hope deteriorate with unease as he saw the black, swirling clouds of the storm, which he now realized sheltered a vortex at its heart. It doesn't make any sense, Dylan whispered for the 10th time. I saw the skull. It talked to me. It advised me. We wouldn't even be here right now if it weren't for it. There's no point in going crazy thinking about it, Dylan. Barb placed a comforting hand on his shoulder as they waited for Maud to undo the gate. Maud had been relatively silent during the walk-in, and now was shuffling onto the compound grounds with a newfound urgency. The four had seen many compounds, but never one like Maud Shaden's. She had turned the 10-acre above-ground area of the emergency camp into a virtual zoo without bars. Everywhere there were animals, mostly cats, running free through the untended tall grass and large tin utility sheds. As the morning light exposed more of the acreage, they spotted deer, cows, and goats grazing on tall patches of weeds. At least 6 horses stood in a group by the fence, nuzzling each other awake as they noticed the presence of strangers. How do you take care of them all? Bill said with wonder as he tried to count the number of overgrown cats that stalked lazily from the far trees to greet Maud for their morning meal. It ain't easy, she said laughing, as she patted a large Himalayan on the head as it rubbed lethargically against her legs. I've got gardens and grain fields placed for all the herbivores, and the cats eat from the food stores below. I've got about 20 dogs too, but they stay together over on the other side by the pond. Where's the Doomcat? Rodney asked, as 3 felines the size of small pumas stared at him with bristling tails and fur. He has his own rooms, down below in the bunker. He's been trying to figure out the computer for months now, since his thumbs finally grew out. But he says that the animal spirit makes it hard for him to concentrate. He's not really all completely in control of himself, since he has to contend with the original spirit of the cat. So, he's kind of sharing residence with the original occupant? Rodney stated. Yeah, I guess you could say that, she answered as she began walking towards the large metallic shed, which was the top entrance to the lower level. Okay, Maud. I've been waiting to ask you, Bill said hesitantly. But why do you call him Doomcat? Because, dear, he's just so damn depressing. The door of the shed led to a small, dark chamber, which sheltered an enormous steel door that led down into the underground barracks. The stairs were metal-grooved and equipped with guardrails on each side, which led down into a dimly lit main room where the long tables sat empty before the large, unused screen of the main computer monitor. Here they were confronted by another assembly of animals who seemed to be using the hall as a den. Why didn't any people come here? Rodney asked, as various raccoons and opossums scurried underfoot. There were for a while, but when that reactor started going into meltdown, they took their chances and left. I tried to tell them that they'd be safe here, but no one would listen to a crazy old lady who talks to cats. Maud flipped a switch, and several lights burst into life over their heads, frightening the animal residents off into other chambers. The hall was thick with the scent of animal droppings and the unmistakable odor of nearby skunk. There were ravaged cans and dry rations lying scattered on the tables where the animals had been feasting for years. The four were beset by the overwhelming feeling that they were in the home of an animal hoarder. Maud led them through the refuse to a door which was the entrance to one of the barracks. As she turned on the lights inside, they saw that the numerous bunks had been moved to far corners of the room, and the mattresses heaped in a pile in the center where a large, dark shape was huddled, unmoving. Chris! Wake up, you lazy thing! Maud yelled in her scratchy, trembling tenor. Spends all night hollering for me to let you in, and then when I do, he takes a nap. Typical. They noted slow movements as the dark furry mound roused from its rest. 2 long pointed ears lifted into the air and twitched as they saw the head of the Doomcat rise. And they found themselves backing a few steps towards the door when the golden eyes opened and fell on them with certain cold intelligence. The Doomcat was as large as any tiger they had ever seen, but its body, covered in long, patterned black and gray fur, had taken on the proportions similar to those of a man. As it first stood on all fours, their eyes widened when it stood bipedal and stretched like a newly awakened man, but yawned with the enormous jaws of a lion. "Well, here they are, you rascal. Now start talking and tell them what you want." They stared in awe as the creature returned to a quadruped pose and approached them languidly before laying down before them. It turned and looked at Maud with sleepy, peaceful eyes as it casually licked its long, hand-like front paw. "He says that first he wants to thank you for your bravery in coming here, and he wants you to know if you can get the computer up." "Yes, we can." Barb stepped forward and spoke directly to the amazing creature, as if addressing an authority figure. "Good. He wants you to know that there are survivors all over Europe, and that they are all blessed of the Black Tiger entity. He says that many are at compounds like this one, and that they have the network there up and running. He thinks that it is possible to link with them via a satellite." "Yes, we think so too. There is another group of the Touched who calls themselves the Ratkin to the north, and they've joined with us on their network." The 4 were looking at each other, communicating wordlessly their surprise at the news of still another group of blessed survivors. "He wants you to know that the storm is not a natural occurrence, and that at its core lays a gate to another sphere. He doesn't know exactly where it goes, but he does know that it is where the spirit of the Black Tiger shaman went upon his departure of this world. He believes that it is an ever-growing vortex caused by the passage of Andrew Love while still in a living form. He fears that the Shadow Walker will soon follow, as it seems to be hunting the sorcerer." "Who was the Black Tiger shaman?" Barb asked, crouching down to look directly into the Doomcat's shining gold eyes. "He was called Cho Fan Yun, and he was close to Angel Love. Cho's spirit told Chris that he felt drawn to the gate and felt that Angel was somewhere on the other side. Cho wanted Chris to know what he had learned before he died, because he feared that in passing through the vortex he may forget the information." "What does he think we should do?" Barb felt a growing uneasiness as Maud grew silent. Looking at the old woman, she saw an expression of mixed pity and fear in her eyes. "Dear, if Doomcat is right, then the Shadow Walker will soon enter the vortex. And when he does, there is nothing that we can do. What happens then?" The 4 were silent and frightened as they searched the faces of Maud and the creature for some hint of what they were implying. "Doomcat thinks if the Shadow Walker passes through the gate, then it will create a vacuum between our sphere and whatever lies on the other side. He thinks that it is entirely possible that our entire reality could be swallowed by the anomaly, and after that, we just don't know." "So we just wait for whatever is going to happen and hope for the best?" Bill burst forth with helpless, questioning fear beneath the red of his eyes. They had not noticed that Dylan was looking at his communicator throughout the entire conversation. "Guys, I think Crawler has other ideas," he said, looking up from beneath his hood. "It seems that there are reports of hundreds of helicopters flying over the United States." "That's frackin' crazy," Rodney exclaimed as he moved to look at the communicator screen. "They've got helicopters. Canadian Air Force helicopters, and they all seem to be headed in this direction." Like rats leaving a sinking ship, Bill said with wonder. Rats can't stand a hole, Maud said flatly, as she scratched her chin and smiled slightly. What do you mean? Barb had stood and began walking towards the door to the main hall to activate the computer, but now stopped and looked at the old woman. Oh, it's a known fact, dear. If you put rats in a maze, they will instinctively enter any hole they find. A rat cannot resist not going through a hole. Well, we have to warn everyone we can that something is going to happen, even if we don't know what. That's just what the Doomcat was saying, Maud said, chuckling. It was a very old zoo, and when Angelica had found herself lost and wandering the long walkways through various exhibits alone, her fear had eventually evolved into curious freedom. At 9 years old, she was a mature child with enough self-control not to instantly burst into frantic tears when she had somehow lost her parents in the throng of patrons gathered at the penguin exhibit. She had sojourned the historic area and marveled at the large stone cages which had once housed the main attractions, but were now a sad reminder of a time when bare, nondescript cages had been the home of numerous once wild animals. She contemplated how much better off the animals were now in modern times, with at least somewhat comfortable natural surroundings in which to exist. At first her wanderings had been without any marked destination, but there, amongst the brick enclosures, she had first glimpsed the tall, robed figure moving ahead of her on the concrete walkway. The figure was tall and enshrouded in a long, flowing robe of dark lavender, as it seemingly floated through the groups of tourists. She wondered why they were not reacting to the bizarre presence as it glided amongst them, and without a thought of caution, followed as it drifted further into the exhibits, towards the area which contained the primate, reptile, and avian houses. The day was cool and bright as she darted between the families and couples, who barely noticed the passing of the small dark-haired girl with startling green eyes any more than they had the robed figure. No matter how much she quickened her pace, the stranger always seemed to be just far enough ahead to stay in sight without her ever gaining any ground. She breathed heavily as she now jogged up the hill along the black railing and stopped just in time to see the figure walking down a stone staircase which led beneath one of the buildings. Slowing, she approached the steps and stared down into the darkness beneath, smelling the varied animal odors carried on the autumn wind. She paused and contemplated abandoning her pursuit and finding some member of the zoo staff to help her locate her parents. However, the desire to see exactly what was beneath the odd cloak of the stranger had become a compelling interest which she could not forsake. She began descending into the cold dark of the stairs. Below there was a long hall which appeared old and unmaintained. She wondered if this was some exhibit left forgotten for years as she studied the cracks and cobwebs which hung draped over every corner of the plaster ceiling. The air was damp and smelled of mildew as she saw a dim light ahead. She entered into a long chamber with a high crumbling ceiling that seemed warped by leaking water and decades of neglect. On each side of the hall there were rows of cages reminiscent of those she had seen above in the historic section. The only light inside the brick cave-like room emanated from an old gas-burning lamps which sat mounted between each of the individual cages. Standing in the center, facing her, with a deep hood of purple hiding its face, was the figure. Her first impulse was to flee, but as a thin, pale hand extended from beneath the shroud and beckoned her to come forward, she no longer sensed that this was an option. She had chosen to follow, and now she must follow through. "Come here, child," said a clear female voice that echoed down the space between her and the form of the shrouded being. "I'm sorry," Angel answered, feeling embarrassed and frightened. I didn't mean to follow." "It's okay," the voice said, soft and reassuring as the hand remained extended, with fingers gently indicating that she should come closer. "I knew you were following me. I wanted you to. to talk to you, Angelica." Her mouth hung slack with wonder at how the strange person knew her name, and despite all common sense, she began to walk slowly towards the woman in violet. She stopped some 6 feet from the figure, and could now see a small, feminine mouth beneath the cowl of the robe, and long strands of white hair running down from within like snowy, frozen streams. "Do you know where you are?" the woman said, letting her arm fall and hand sink back into the lavender folds. Angel shook her head in response. "This is the special animals exhibit. Look into the cages." Angel did as she was told and was swept away in wonder and confusion, as when she saw that to her side, shackled in heavy chains within the enclave of the wall, was a massive black wolf which stared back at her with dark black eyes. She looked to the other side and was even more surprised by the sight of an enormous rat as big as a mountain lion, also chained within the enclosure. "These animals are all very dangerous and must be kept bound, so they will not harm each other or us." Angel's gaze fell to the next cage and saw that within it lay coiled a snake, larger than any she had ever seen, wrapped in thick black chains which held it to the wall. "Down there are where the most dangerous are kept," the woman said, as she turned gracefully and began walking towards the far end of the room. Angel followed quietly as she studied the next exhibit, which contained a creature that resembled nothing more than a giant fly, beside a cage in which a huge centipede was chained. Angel had never seen animals like these before, and she trembled as she saw the shining black worm-like creature in the following enclosure. At the very end, she saw that the cage was open, and at first, fearing its inhabitants had escaped, she froze in place. "It's okay. This one is empty," the woman explained, as she placed a soft, gentle hand on her shoulder. "The animal that goes in there will not be bound until all the others are safely locked away." What kind of animal is it?" Angel asked as she looked up into the woman's hidden face. She watched as the woman placed 2 fingers between her lips and blew a whistle, and Angel heard a rustling sound as a large black bird flew from the shadows and landed on the woman's shoulder. Angel smiled when she recognized it as a black raven with 2 eyes that shimmered like amethyst. "You shouldn't lock the raven up," Angel said, studying its ebony feathers as it stretched its wide black wings. It's beautiful." "Yes, it is. But it can be dangerous just the same. They will all be bound, and then they will not be able to hurt anyone ever again. But you shouldn't worry, because you are safe here. I just want you to stay with your parents and play as much as you like. I will collect these creatures, and we will never have to worry about them again." Angel thought that she hadn't ever been worried since she didn't know these things even existed. But she did not say that to the sad woman, since it might upset her even more. "You should go now, Angel, and find your parents. They are looking for you." Angel turned and began walking away past the strange collection of weird animals, and was further amazed that there were even more cages ranging down the other hall. As she reached the exit, she turned to say goodbye, but the woman and the raven were gone. "Is she gonna wake up?" Jesse asked the spectral form of his brother, as the giant wolf creature gently laid Angel's still form on their mother's bed and covered her carefully in a layer of knitted quilts. The room was dark, but for the row of candles he had lit along his mother's dresser and an ornate oil lamp which now sat on the side by the table. Which one? Angel or Mom? Ryan was in the other room, hovering by their mother with cold disgust before emerging in the doorway. Mom will wake up eventually, but Angel's in some kind of coma. She might need a doctor or something. Are the phones working? The ghost of the black adolescent boy asked as he wandered over to stare with awe at the werewolf. We need to find Diedrich and Cho. Nothing electric is working. Diedrich is probably sick at his house like the rest of the town, and God only knows about Cho. Jesse was studying himself in the mirror and shaking his head with self-deprecating laughter at the sight of his child's face staring back. This is crazy. What the hell did she do? I think it's pretty clear that Angel made a cozy little pocket sphere for us here in Mississippi. Ryan was watching as the werewolf seated itself on the side of the bed, which creaked and groaned beneath its massive weight. I should have known it was too good to be true. A goddamn college in the middle of a swamp in Mississippi. All that was missing was a unicorn that shits rainbows. You still talking to your brother? The werewolf's voice was deep and resonant as it looked over its shoulder at Jesse. Yeah, we're still trying to get a handle on all this, Jesse answered. He approached the creature cautiously and studied the odd human expression of concern in its dark eyes. So, you're really her father? Yep. Just call me Steve. Can you tell us anything that might help us? Look, that corpse thing that's flying around. The Shadow Walker. Right. He's after something. He got Andrew Love, and whatever it did with him, I think he's no longer the real problem. That gateway over the lake in the woods is getting bigger, and I'm beginning to think that we've got a lot more on our plate than we suspect. Now you say you're not really a kid, and after seeing what you can do, I believe you. The only one that I can think of that can give us any answer is the skull, and I've only seen him in dreams. You used his power. Can you contact him? My brother, the ghost, was the last one to speak with it, but we can't just dial him up if that's what you mean. The skull does its own thing and shows up when it wants to. Great, Steven said as he brushed the long beard-like fur that hung from his massive jaws with a great clawed hand. I just wish I knew what it wanted us to do. You and me both. Jesse turned to the apparition, which now stood listening patiently. So what about it, bro? Can you gather some intelligence for us, since you're the only one who can get around in this nightmare right now? I will, but it's not safe for me as you think. The Shadow Walker can see me, and he can also hurt me. Well, you better get to it. It won't be long before those things start coming back for us. Ryan nodded his consent to the plan and then disappeared through the wall. Ryan is going to try and find out where the others are and try to give us some perspective on this. In the meantime, I suggest we think of a way into town. Does your mom have a car? I hope you like station wagons, Steve. Ryan had learned that spirits travel in a daze of images that made it almost impossible to focus for extended lengths of time. A ghost does not perceive through senses, but instead is processing environments through a kind of consciousness more akin to dream states than waking, living reality. As Ryan traveled the road back into town, he was caught up in strange glimpses of the events around him, which could easily distract him if he allowed the peculiar quality of lostness to grip his mind. He could see that the transfigured dead were amassing in a group as they shambled closer to the town, and at their lead was the body of the Shadow Walker, floating above them like a general over his army as he swam in a swarm of twisted, mutated insect creatures. The very fabric of this world seemed to be disrupted and breaking at the seams as the scenery fluctuated and distorted. One moment he would be on the road, and the next lost in twisted, writhing trees. Ryan knew that in moments the army would fall upon the town and wreak devastation like nothing he was capable of imagining. He focused on the college and pictured himself on a wind being carried to his goal. He smiled with satisfaction as his astral form began flying over the ground like a bird in flight, speeding ahead of the horrid collection of walking corpse mutants and into the town. Diedrich stumbled out of bed, still in his pants and undershirt, across the dark room into the kitchen. His trembling, feverish hands fumbled at the light switch, which he flicked to no avail. "The power is out," he said to himself as he glimpsed out the kitchen windows and saw the storm raging outside. He sighed and cursed the ancient power grid in the area as he founded glass in the dark and poured himself water from the tap. He gulped thirstily and stared out the windows, leaning on the sink warily. That was when he saw the giant fly, with squirming leech-like tentacles instead of wings, slam into the glass and hang there, pulsing horribly. He screamed and fell back as the glass fell from his hand and shattered on the floor. "What's on to fell?" he shouted as he studied the strangely familiar creature. In the recesses of his mind, he kept seeing flashes of a woods and a cave. He remembered hearing a voice crying within, but could not bring the vision into clear mental focus. He jumped as he felt a touch on his shoulder, but relaxed as he heard his wife's voice in the darkness. "Dieter, are you okay?" she said from the darkness. I think I am hallucinating," he said as he rubbed his face. "Watch your step, my neighbor. I dropped a glass. So clumsy. I will clean it up." He watched as she crouched down onto her knees in the darkness and began picking up the pieces of glass in her hand. And then to his horror, he heard crunching sounds coming from beneath the long, tangled gray hair that fell down over her face. "What are you doing?" he shouted as he grabbed her by the shoulders and, stooping down, looked at her face. He froze with terror and fell back as the huge multifacets of flies' orbs stared back from where her eyes should have been. Blood trickled from her mouth as she chewed the chunks of glass like brittle candy. He fell back and scrambled across the floor as her nightgown parted to reveal the long, black, reaching legs of a millipede stretched out as she began to stalk towards him. Fighting hysteria, he crawled to where his gun belt hung on the back of the kitchen chair. The .38 in hand, he reflexively pulled the trigger, emptying each cartridge into the horror's face. It fell back with little more than a mound of putrid red flesh and brains on its shoulders, but still continued reaching and stumbling about the kitchen, seen by the blue strobe of the strange lightning from outside. He leapt to his feet and snatched the belt as he ripped his keychain from the wooden key pegs that hung on the wall by the window. He ran out the door and into his garage, where the squad car was parked and waiting. He got inside and turned on the ignition with shaking hands as the CD player came on automatically, playing the last song he'd been listening to on the way home, Beethoven's Ode to Joy. He slammed the car into reverse and crashed into the still-closed garage door. Fumbling, he found the opener and hit the button, but the mangled tin of the door would not raise, and screeching, thudding, and breaking with each attempt. Once more, his socked foot pressed the accelerator down, and finally the door was dislodged from its rails and fell over the car as he backed recklessly into the street, hitting the parked car of his neighbors across the road, which immediately began sounding as its loud, squalling alarm. Plunging the car into gear, he began speeding down the street through the rain before realizing that he had no idea where to go. He wondered how long he had been in bed with fever, and seeing the date on his watch, realized that he had been bedridden for close to 2 days. He was weak, feverish, and sick, but even this condition, he saw the boy standing in the road. He slammed on his brakes and skidded sideways on the wet pavement, just barely stopping before crashing into the child. Thinking he had to rescue the child before he was attacked, he opened the car door and stood half in the rain, calling, "Young boy, you must come with me." It was only then that he recognized the adolescent as young Ryan Rose, who had been lost in the woods by Cemetery Hill. "Ryan, you must get in the car," he shouted as he stepped out and began approaching the shirtless boy as wind blew torrents of cold rain in sheets over the street. He stopped suddenly when he saw that he could clearly see the outline of the hedges that lined the sidewalk behind the boy through his slender body. Ryan raised his right arm and pointed urgently in the direction of the town square. Dietrich stood mouth agape as he read the motions of Ryan's moving lips and understood that he was clearly repeating, "Go to the college," over and over. Then in an instant, Ryan was gone, and Dietrich stood wondering and afraid in the rain until he noticed dark, buzzing shapes landing like black meteors on the road and in the moss-laden trees of the neighborhood. He ran back to his car and, slamming the door, made a U-turn in the street, running over the curb, and drove with mad speed for the college. Kurt and Cho crept along the hallway, carefully cracking doors along the way, peering into each room as they passed. Every bed contained a writhing, sick student, and no one seemed awake or conscious in the shadows of the dorm. "They're all here," Joe said with wonder, as his golden eyes flashed reflexively in the darkness. "She brought us all here. Rick, Sherry, Darla, Kira, Christoph. You were all her friends," Kurt said as he tried to fathom whatever line of reasoning Joe was following. "Yes, and they were all victims of the Shadow Walker. After they died, their bodies all disappeared until Dietrich found them hanging in a butcher shop in Washington. The Shadow Walker was doing something to them, changing them into mutants or something. I think we should try to wake them up." "Okay, but Kira lives off campus, and she went home to rest after everyone here was taken care of. We'll have to go for her after we get the others up." Kira lay sweating in the blankets of the vast four-poster bed, watching as red and yellow lightning alternated in sudden bursts outside the second-story windows of her bedroom. She gazed around the room at the various antiques she adored and wished she could make her way to the piano so that she could play and comfort herself. She was overwrought with a feeling of unease, which became more pronounced as the thunder shook the small glasses and statuettes which stood grouped along the many shelves and tables of her room. She had awakened after another long marathon of nightmares which had plagued her every sleeping moment, and now wished only that she could get out of bed and return to the college to see how the students were doing. She was concerned about Angel, alone in her little house so far away. She reached for her cell phone, which lay beside her on the table, and pushed the on button only to find that she had no connection. "Oh, the wonders of modern technology," she sighed as she dropped it back down with irritation. She realized that she had to urinate but could not muster enough energy to even raise herself for the simple task. She also realized that her box of cigarettes was empty, and this she could not tolerate. She dragged herself to a sitting position on the side of the bed, placed her bare feet on the cold floor as the room spun disconcertedly. After her head had settled and her eyes focused, she began to stand, but stopped and fell back to the bed when she gazed on through the wooden boards of the floor. It was covered in a solid carpet of insects and worms, which ranged all the way from the wall to her bed. She screamed and raised her knees to her chest, but to her horror the invading pests were now scurrying over the bedclothes in the hundreds. She kicked at the blankets and curled into a sobbing ball at the headboard as voices hollow and dark echoed through the room in unison. "Do you remember me?" The voice said as a figure appeared in the darkness on the other side of the room. She was too terrified to speak as several centipedes began climbing at the bottom of her nightgown, and she hysterically lashed out at them in tears. "It is time for you to come back to me, Kara." The voice said as a floating corpse drifted into the dim light through the window. "Go away!" she screamed as she tried to awaken from what she knew had to be another one of the horrible fever-induced nightmares. "Come to me," it said as the insect army invaded, and she vanished, screaming in their ranks. The windows of the college exploded simultaneously as if a blast of pressure had burst from within. The students, which they had managed to awaken, stood groggy and terrified as the wind and the rain from the storm outside violated the inner sanctum of the school with cold, stinging rain. The front doors were torn open by an unseen force and ripped from their hinges as shambling horrors crept in droves across the campus yard, and venomous, black-spewing monstrosities landed on the roof. Cho opened fire on the crawling horrors, which were now seeking entrance to the windows as Kurt ushered the students down the stairs. In the main room, they were met by the twisted forms of rotting insect dead who lunged forward with hands that writhed like leeches and mouths filled with horrid, snapping pincers. Cho pushed his way through the screaming, terrified group and began an unbelievable retaliation of gunshots, which shattered the soft pulp of the creatures' heads. The air was filled with stinging, deformed horrors which the students frantically swiped and clawed to be free of. In the midst of the nightmare storm, Kurt heard a voice calling from outside. Sidestepping the reaching claws of the controlled dead, he saw the figure of a young boy standing outside, desperately begging them to follow. Turning to the others, he yelled over the screams for them to flee outside, and as he hoped that this might be some salvation, he, Cho, and the 4 victims of the Shadow Walker fled at the front as many others fell to the undead minions of the late Harris Levine. Kurt fought to ignore the calls of so many who were being torn and ripped by the claws of the dead as he led them to the gate where the boy now stood. In the distance, he heard another sound over the wind and realized with dawning clarity that it was the sound of a police siren. He saw the lights of a squad car flashing down the road through the storm as it splashed through puddles and slid to a stop in the parking lot. Kurt recognized the police chief of Mossborough as he stepped from the car with a pump-action shotgun and ran to their aid, firing shots at the creatures which followed. Just as he thought that perhaps all hope was not yet lost, he heard the humming sound which deafened him to all others. A giant shape was descending from the abysmal darkness above, and when he saw what it was, he could only fall to the ground, lost in despair and horror. In the shape of a mosquito, with a body formed from the moldering, rotted bones of the long dead, on wings which hummed like the whirling blades of a helicopter as it attacked the lead group and grasped the 2 women, Darla and Sherry, with long worm-like tentacles. Cho reloaded and fired into the creature's eyes, but no injury could deter the horror from its mission. In moments, another was upon them, the size of a van, as it lashed out and captured Christoph and Rick in the rope-like appendages which writhed from its body. Diedrich was firing at it, but both had rose up and disappeared into the storm from whence they had came. "Quickly! We must go!" Diedrich called over the cries of the dying students. "We cannot leave them!" Cho screamed as he fired at the still attacking dead desperately. "There is no hope for them. We must go!" Cho paused and dropped his arms with a last gesture of hopeless loss. Then Kurt watched as trembling Cho gave forth a scream, which changed gradually into the unmistakable roar of some big cat. Grabbing Cho, he pulled him away from the gates of the college as within all descended into an anarchy of mind-bending death and destruction. As he dragged his weeping, furious friend to the car, he heard the voice of the boy speaking within his mind. "You must go to the house of Jesse Rose by the cemetery. They can protect you." They climbed into the back of the police car as Diedrich slammed his door and sped off into the town. Kurt sat numb and awash in a paranoid terror that froze his every last nerve with biting electric fear. The only sounds he could hear were the splash of puddles against the car tires, the sound of distant thunder, and Beethoven's Ninth Symphony playing from the speakers by his head. They now had even crossed into the square when they first glimpsed the shrouded violet specter which was floating towards the steps of the library. "Steve," Jesse said to the werewolf, who currently was rummaging through the refrigerator, collecting a buffet of leftovers in the cradle of his long left arm. "Yeah, kid, I mean Jess, what's up?" Steve carefully laid the assembled Tupperware and plastic-wrapped dinner plates on the table as he was thumped in the head by the low-lying ceiling fan. He crouched slightly and looked into the small bedroom where Jesse had been reading an issue of Popular Mechanics by the bedside. However, now he was standing on alert at the foot of the bed, over which Angel, still unconscious, was floating, with the quilts hanging down like a patchworked tablecloths. "Holy cow," Stephen said, as he noticed the violet aura which was radiating out from the blankets and from around Angel's still round face. They watched as she slowly tilted upright, and the quilt slid to the floor in a pile beneath her floating feet. They watched in awe as a physical change began to overtake the suspended girl. Her hair was growing gradually longer and fading to a pale white as the roundness of her cheeks became more sunken and hollow. Her eyes were sinking deep into their sockets as if she were aging before their eyes. The violet glow grew so bright as to be blinding as it filled the room, and when it had dimmed, the person that they had known as Angelica Love was gone, replaced by the looming, enshrouded figure of the skull. "No, this can't be right," Jesse said as the specter began to drift across the room, seemingly oblivious to their presence, before passing without resistance into the wall. Why did Angel turn into the skull?" Jesse said, completely dumbstruck. "I don't know," Steve said over his shoulder as he rushed through the house, knocking over table lamps in the process. Flinging open the front door, he stepped out into the rushing wind and watched as the floating, shrouded being continued a slow course down the road towards the town. Should we wait for Ryan?" Jesse said as he appeared at Steven's side. "Maybe we can meet them on the way. Think you can drive that station wagon? I'm tall for my age, but I will need a pillow or something to sit on. I'll get your mom, and we'll just hope she doesn't wake up while I'm carrying her to the car." Stephen hurriedly lifted the unconscious woman from where she still lay on the couch and followed the small pajama-clad boy to the back door which led to the garage. There he watched as Jesse flipped a switch on the wall and turned on an overhead light, revealing the solid brown station wagon within. Jesse quickly opened the driver door and, flinging in a pillow he had brought from the house, climbed into and set the keys into the ignition. Pushing a switch clipped up on the sun visor, the garage door began a slow humming ascent as it opened. "How are we going to do this? I don't think you can even fit in the car," Jesse said as Stephen carefully laid Miss Rose snoring into the back seat. Diedrich slammed on the brakes and stared in astonishment as the haunting cloaked apparition floated to the steps of the library. It turned slowly within the folds of its long covering, whipping and flowing in the intense wind as he caught glimpses of the visage which lay beneath the cowl of the robe. As if suddenly awakening from dream, he felt the cold ache and fever break as at last he began to remember the life he had once led. He, Joe, and Kurt stepped from the car and stood together, pelted by falling rain, as they saw a swirling wall of blackness emerging in the distance from the direction of the Love estate. The sky was a tempest of lightning and swirling clouds that seemed to be devoured by the black wall. Before any could speak, their attention was drawn to a car speeding into the town square. As it drew closer, they could clearly discern the shape of a huge animal clinging as if for dear life to the top as it swerved and fishtailed down the street. At first they could see no driver, but as it drew closer, the very top of a boy's dark head could be seen over the steering wheel. The car pulled to a sudden stop in the middle of the street as the beast was thrown off and landed, rolling across the pavement. The three looked at each other in complete bafflement as the creature stood and shook water from its fur in a fine spray. The car door opened, and a small boy in pajamas jumped out and ran to the creature with concern. The beast patted the boy reassuringly on the head before lifting him onto his shoulders and, piggybacking him, began to walk towards them on all fours. Kurt smiled despite the horrors he had seen and broke into a run towards the massive creature. Stephen stopped and gazed at the man who now stood before him, breathless and soaked in cold rain. "So I didn't just dream you up," Kurt said as he placed a pale hand on the werewolf's thick shoulder. He felt the muscles beneath heave as the creature sobbed and tears ran down the fur of his cheeks and jaws. "I told you I was out there, buddy," Stephen said as he wrapped a long, powerful arm around Kurt and pulled him close like a rag doll. "I'm so sorry, Kurt. I tried so hard to save you." The beast wept as it clutched the small, thin man as if fearful of letting go. "It's okay now, Steve. I'm alive, and we're here in this nightmare together," Kurt said, scratching behind Stephen's ears like an overgrown pet. "But back in the other world, did we stop him? I took your hand." and I put it on the love woman before she could damage or change like Andrew. Then he got me, but the wolf god did something before we came here. I'm not sure, but I think there's still a world left out there somewhere. But all this is mixed up. Angel turned into the skull. Kurt stared at Stephen's wide, confused eyes before turning and looking at the apparition standing between the pillars of the library as the vortex grew in power and size overhead. That's not possible, he whispered with complete disbelief. I saw it with my own eyes, Kurt. I don't know how or why, but Angelica is the skull. What if somehow she always was the skull? But why would she do this? Kurt left Stephen's embrace and walked slowly back through the rushing, intense wind, with Stephen following close behind. He looked at Diedrich and Cho with confusion battling within his rationale mind, as if he were looking at a puzzle of which none of the pieces would fit. What is it? Diedrich questions, as he fought to understand for himself what was occurring. Angel is the skull, Kurt said with conflicting doubt and trust with what he had been told. Joe looked as if he had been struck, as he stared down at the water rushing over the street in a near flood. He told me, he said, holding up his hands as if to beg for mercy. The sorcerer said that the skull wasn't real. He said that it had been a hoax from the beginning, created by Arcana and Athanasi. How did Angel become the skull? How could we forget? We have forgotten a great many things since we were brought here, Diedrich said, as he began to process what he was learning, piece interlocking with piece until a picture began to appear. I suspect that Angelica has intentionally left us in the dark with some purpose. Kurt left the group and walked with grim determination towards the specter of the skull. He climbed the stairs and stood before it, the others close behind. Is it true? He yelled over the wind, rain, and lightning. Angel, is that you? The specter did not respond, but stood still and silent as the force of the storm grew to a horrifying peak. Angel, what have you done? What have you done? From within the flowing robes a voice emerged, first as a low Russian man, but altering into that of Angel's, commanding feminine shout. They must be bound, she called. And as they watched, the visage of the skull transformed into the thin, lovely face they all knew as Angel's, framed in a long, flowing white hair. Are you mad? Kurt yelled as he stepped closer. Who must be bound? The entities, Kurt. All of them must be contained. This all must end. Herr Hartmann, she means to imprison the avatars, Diedrich shouted as he grabbed Kurt's arm. She will lock them away in this sphere. They watched as the purple light began to emanate from Angel's form in a fire of amethyst around her. They will all come, if only for the chance that they might escape the desolation of the lost earth, Angel said as she raised her arms and robe, parted to reveal her body, which was naked and covered in stitched wounds beneath. Kurt stared in horror at the cold, pale texture of her skin, recognizing each wound from the night he had first found her, wounded in the darkness. Realization began to dawn on him as he remembered the legend of the skull. Angel had somehow managed to travel not only between spheres, but through time, as only the dead can do. Yet, she had still maintained a physical form throughout her journeys. He remembered Cho saying that Angel had split her soul in two, and the other piece had remained unaccounted for, as a young, amnesiac version of her had lingered here. Was it possible that she had made the lie a reality? Could Angel, upon her death, have created this subsphere and left a piece of her identity as a guardian, while the other, more powerful aspect had entered her corpse and made it a vessel, just as the Russians supposedly had in the legend of the skull? Had she step by step organized the events over the past centuries in an attempt to rid the multiverse of the anomalies she had judged too dangerous to be allowed freedom? Had she known that eventually, if Andrew were left alone without his mate, he would go insane and find his way through a gate in the spheres while still possessed of his biological living form, thereby opening a channel of energy which would become a vacuum-like vortex which would eventually consume both realities. What would happen if she succeeded? She would draw in all the avatars and seal them here, closing off the gate and leaving whatever survivors there were in that other destroyed world to suffer without the aid of their new gods. What chance would there be for them without their shamans? And what of Stephen and Cho? Would they be locked here in a nightmare world, fighting for eternities with the likes of the Shadow Walker and Andrew Love? And then a thought occurred to him. As he looked over at Dietrich, he knew that his thoughts had been shared. Dieter leapt up the steps to stand beside Kurt, and he saw a frightened determination crease the older man's brow as Cho appeared at his other side with the gleaming golden cat's eyes. "Angelica!" Dieter shouted, as the violet inferno around Angel began to take the shape of a fiery bird. "Where is Andrew?" Angel's glowing eyes fell upon the German policeman with distant recognition. "He's bound within his beloved house," she answered, as she lowered her arms and gazed intensely at Dietrich. "And how did you manage that, one my kind?" he said, moving forward carefully. "The Shadow Walker sealed him there," she answered, her voice cold and otherworldly. "And how did the Shadow Walker know that this was even a possibility?" "It was told by the skull." "Oh, you clever girl. You tricked him, didn't you? So much like your aunt and uncle to manipulate and use others as pawns." Angel grew still as the flames receded slightly, and she gazed with fury at the old man. "I am nothing like them. They are evil, destructive monsters. I turned them against one another for the greater good of all." "Oh, so they are all monsters, are they? And what are you? A corpse in a cloak, floating through the universe, plotting to create a hell in which to dispose of spirits, whether they are good or evil. What of your friends, Angelica? What of them? They will be trapped here as well, will they not? All those people who loved you and cared for you, that you used for bait in your little game. You have become as twisted and as sick as the snakes which spawned you." The rage which poured out from Angel was reflected in the darkening energy she emanated. "How dare you? I was tortured and beaten in the darkness by brainwashed children, and you call me a monster. I was murdered, Dietrich, and I was gunned down by teenagers in an airport trying to bring justice to your killer. And this is how I am repaid. To be locked in your cage of spirits." Dietrich leapt forward and grabbed onto Angel's arms, and opening himself, began to siphon the overwhelming power flowing from her. Looking deep into the glowing orbs of her eyes, he said, "You have forgotten that I am no shaman. We are as you once were, Angelica. We are Engikok, the thieves of energy." With sorrow rushing through every material fiber of his being, Kurt stepped forward and grabbed onto Angel's arm. Shaking with the sudden rush of energy which flowed up through his hands, Jesse had run up the steps and grabbed her other arm, and as his very gift was the absorption of energy, the light around Angel deteriorated, and they were left holding only the cold vessel of Angel's body. She crumbled to the granite steps as they knelt around her, meeting her empty green eyes with shame and pity in their own. "Guys, there are 3 ghosts over there, and the one that looks like a priest says he is a friend of Cho's," Jesse said, pointing to a spot beside Stephen, who was weeping into his great clawed hands as Cho held his arm with sadness. "Christophorus," Cho said, searching with his golden eyes for what could not be seen. He says that the vortexes have opened all over the lost earth, and the avatars are going to enter. The skull has convinced them all it is an escape, and they will not be dissuaded. Go then, came the soft whisper of Angel's voice. When the vortex consumes the mansion, it will reclaim Andrew, and it will close. The gate has been searching for him. You have taken my energy, and so the portals I opened will begin to close as well. But you are too late to save the other avatars. They will be imprisoned with me. All you must do is die, and your spirits may cross back. But I warn you that if my father or Cho escape, all this will begin again. I was going to draw all of the serpent's energy through to this side, but he will pass back through, and the world will remain a sphere of the snake. However, if he remains bound, then he will be helpless to control his minions. I will not leave you, the werewolf said as it climbed the steps and knelt at Angel's side. I have failed you in the past, and now I will endure with you. I have failed you as well, Angelica. It was my duty to protect you, and still you fell. I will stay here, and we will share this fate. Kneeling as well, Cho pushed back the violent cowl and held her head gently in his arms. If this is your will, then we will not contest it. Angel, Jesse said as tears ran down his round child cheeks. One of the ghosts is your mother, Maxine. She says that she will remain as well. The third is Ryan, and he wants you to know that he loves you and is sorry. I know. I see them there, she replied, smiling serenely. Perhaps I will finally get to know my family. I will stay as well, Dietrich said, standing and gazing into the vortex. Me too, Kurt added, placing his hand on the older man's shoulder. I don't think so, Joe said as he stood and pulled his guns from where they were tucked behind his back. You guys are going back. That world is going to need you. Jesse's eyes widened as Kurt and Dietrich looked back at Joe to find the pistols aimed at their heads. And if I hear of your ghost spooking around the sphere, then you better watch out. There were 3 clear gunshots that rang out over the sound of the storm as 3 bodies fell lifeless to the steps. Cho knelt beside Angel and held her cold body to his chest. Angelica, Stephen said, studying her hollow, thin face. If the avatars pass through the vortex alive, then won't the gate stay open? They will not pass through alive, she answered calmly. Why not? Cho asked. There is something waiting for them on the border of the vortex. They felt a rumble like the tremors of a small-scale earthquake as a flash of green light burst in the distance within the storm. They all knew that this was the Love Mansion being swallowed and absorbed by the gate. I just hope no one ever lets that bastard out, Stephen growled as the storm seemed to ease off. You chose to spare the lives of those living in the lost earth. A choice that I, myself, might have made once. They may still be doomed, but rest assured their chances are greater than if they had been brought here. Taking her thin arms, they lifted her from the steps and together walked down into the street. Cho lifted her onto Stephen's back, and for a moment she lay embracing the soft fur of her father, and then sitting upright she gazed around the dark storm-raged town of Mossborough. There are still many people living here, she said with a twinge of conscience and pain. Perhaps we can protect them, she said, looking at Cho. And even though he knew her to be a being like none he had ever imagined, a spirit joined to the flesh of its former life, he saw in her eyes the first glimmer of the person he had known as Angelica Love. I tried another way, you know, she said sadly. I went back and found my past incarnation, Arkip Zolkin, and I tried to convince her to stop the ritual of the Van Dulivers. She went into hysterics and fell weeping on the floor. When I returned to 2021, all that had changed was a new letter explaining to Afanasi how she couldn't jeopardize her reputation. Joe stared back, speechless with wonder. But what about the Mascatovs? A whole family of psychics. That's why Maxiamano was really imprisoned. He was the fool who let out all the entities loose in the first place. The Katorga, where he was sent, was a gold mining labor camp. They had come across a cavern sealed for 1,000 years by ancient shamans, and he used his abilities to release them. He was executed before he could ever learn how to use the power of the entities, but many of them still sought out his bloodline, one of whom was Harris Levine. I believe that Andrew had somehow traced Harris's genealogy back to the Mascatovs and knew that they would come to him if he called. They recognized his DNA. And all my friends, the 5, which now have been claimed by the Shadow Walker, are all descendants and perhaps even reincarnation of the original Mascatov children. The entities will abandon the corpse vessel and take resident within each of them, thereby granting each its own avatar, just as they tried to do back in the other world before Dieter killed Harris. These entities will have to fight to save what living people there are here. Look on the bright side, he said, taking her hand and kissing its cold skin with warm, loving lips. At least you won't have to do a talk show. They had watched and waited as the Doomcat slept in a death-like trance for hours upon hours. Barb had openly informed everyone with access to the network of everything she knew. They had limited contact with the groups outside of the United States, but she had learned that they, like Crawler and his followers, were planning on entering vortexes, which had opened over the past month in various areas in various parts of the world. Crawler's Legion had taken helicopters from numerous air bases along the northern eastern border and with full fuel tanks headed for Mississippi. Their goal was to get as close to the vortex as possible before their fuel reserves were depleted, and then march the rest of the way through the swamps. Barb had at first laughed when she thought of their experiences at the barn, but then reports had been sent describing hundreds of the Ratkin leaping from the helicopters armed to the teeth with explosives and state-of-the-art firepower. They had begun blasting their way through the swamp at a phenomenal pace, and within a day of landing were approaching the horizon of the vortex. It had been that which to the Doomcat had awakened, and not with the good news the 4 had prayed for. As he explained via Maud's translation all that he had witnessed on the other side of the portal, they were dumbfounded, and even more at a loss for how to proceed than before. "Well, we have to warn them all," Bill said, wild-eyed and apparently surprised there was even a question as to the course of action. "But what if Angel is right?" Dylan said, drawing stunned silence from his friend. They now stood outside the compound looking downhill over a field which led to the forest, now being consumed in the pitch black of the darkness. "How could she be right, Dylan? She has gone insane," Bill pleaded. "She guided us and saved us," Dylan answered, his internal conflict a vicious war of feeling wrestling rationale as he tried to comprehend some truth by which to act. "As part of her plan," Rodney said calmly from where he sat with Barb and Sheldon in the grass by the wall of the compound. "She used us all, Dylan. And she'll have all the avatars locked away all nice and tidy inside a big ball of nightmare." "I agree with them, Dylan," Barb said, taking her communicator from her pocket. "Like it or not, the animal gods were the only thing that saved our asses from extinction, ironically." "Yeah, from another animal god," Dylan countered solemnly. "No, from a man using the power of a god," Rodney said thoughtfully. "Power that might be better off locked away." Dylan felt the wind from the distant vortex rushing over him, and once more he felt the familiar electric tingle of shamanic energy. "It doesn't matter," Bill shouted as if he might strike Dylan out of frustration. Their followers are people, you dick. Stop acting like you're some kind of high judge of the universe, and remember that good people don't let other people die unnecessarily. We don't let thousands of what might be the last remnants of the human race go walking off into a wormhole because it might be for the best. Barbara, get to dialing. Dylan hung his head chastened as Bill turned his back on him in disgust. He was just beginning to apologize when Barb's communicator linked to Crawler. Crawler stared at the screen of the handheld device, listening carefully as the wolf girl semi-hysterically explained that no one should enter the vortex, that this was all a trap, and that everyone should more or less pack up and go home. He responded only with a simple, cold thank you before switching her off and gazing across the grassy field before him at the wall of the vortex border. Nasher had overheard the conversation and was staring at him expectantly. "You don't actually believe that, do you?" Her tone was half mocking as she studied the ancient depths of his enormous dark eyes. He pulled at the long gray whiskers on his chin as he thought. "I told you not to underestimate them," he said quietly, as he contemplated the emptiness of the whirling gate, which seemed intent on devouring the world. He would have laughed had he known what Maud Shaden had said about rats and holes, for even now as his desire to see what was on the other side of the portal was unbearable. However, he turned his gaze to the hundreds of ratkin marching from the forest into the clearing. His concern seemed to override his curiosity. "I will go alone, and make sure that it is not as they say." "No, you cannot. That is ridiculous. How can you even suggest leaving us here?" Nasher had never questioned Crawler until now. "So I should disregard the faith that all of you have placed in me and lead you all into a fate worse than death." Before she could respond, Crawler abruptly turned away and began walking across the clearing towards the looming wall of the vortex. Stopping halfway, he called out over his shoulder, "If it is not as they say, then I will return for you, I promise." As he neared the edge of the whirling blackness, he felt the strong pull of the gate's vacuum drawing him forward. The air was charged with a dense energy that was biting and cold as the strongest electric current. At the borderline, he could see that the very earth was distorted and warped by the presence of the phenomenal void, as if liquefied and dissolved by the wall of blackness. There he stood staring into the darkness and felt terror at the unknown experience that lay waiting before him as he prepared to step off into the tarn of infinity. It was then that he witnessed with disbelief that something was moving within the emptiness, and as the pinpoints of violet light began to manifest in the hundreds before him, he stepped back. The ratkin would then observe a sight witnessed the world over as the avatars neared the portal's edge. Thousands of black ravens, the size of birds of prey, erupting from within the vortex, with glowing purple eyes as they attacked the waiting forms of the shamans. The birds formed a cloud of black feathered wings around Crawler as they tore and ripped at his body, with razor-like talons and hard, cutting beaks which cut, stabbed, and severed until only pieces of the shaman's body was left to be absorbed in the tremendous pull of the black portal. The followers stood in shocked silence before a few cried out, and then the many fell weeping to the ground. Only now did the vortex begin to recede, and the winds began to finally die down. Within hours the storm would at last disperse, and the green of morning sky become visible. The sorrow and confusion would last days, as every man, woman, and child feared the tremendous absence of the power which had so long infused their being. The army of rats, which had accompanied them soon, would depart into the wild, as lost as the people with whom for a time they had shared a sacred bond. The time of the shamans was at its end, or so it was believed. It seemed so strange to watch, as the trees of the forest at last ceased their tortured writhing and once more became still and resolute. The group was silent as they made their way down the road towards Mississippi, where Doomcat had said that they would find a mansion before the ghost within had left from its feline host forever. Rodney and Bill had not yet begun to return to their human forms as they had anticipated. They had received word that morning that the followers of the rat shaman were returning north, and that there was some talk that they would join with the survivors in the American townships. But they as well were still carrying the distinct physical characteristics of their patron spirit. What had begun as a hurried evacuations of southern and eastern compounds near reactors had been underway until their inhabitants realized that they were not losing their supernatural resistance to the effects of radiation. There seemed only one task left for the four in the south before they would return and take Maud Shaden north. They had to see the mansion and make sure that the sorcerer was sealed within. The journey took many days, even on the horses provided by Maud. They camped and talked of what life would be like now without the power of the wolf god to protect them. But the emptiness they felt was a despair and loss that could not be defined by words. In time, they passed through the half-sunken remnants of a deserted town like so many others through which they had traveled. They would not even have known their destination was near if it were not for a sign lying covered in weeds by the road which led, "Welcome to Mossborough, home of the Cottonmouth." They found a small cemetery barely visible above the swamp, and from there came to a path which led to a great stone wall rising up from the bayou. They climbed the wall and sat perched on its edge, gazing out over a vast lake which spanned for miles. There was no sign of the mansion, but both Dylan and Barb could see and sense its presence deep below the snake-infested floodwaters. As they contemplated what they saw in silence, Dylan glanced down at his hands, which were tingling with strange but familiar warmth. He held them up, and still present claws shone, a glowing green mist emanating from his fingertips. "The power is still here," he said, as the cuts, bruises, and scrapes of the long journey were healed from his flesh. "Then there is hope after all," Barb said as tendrils of emerald light flickered from her own hands. "That's just it," Rodney said, scratching the thick white fur of his neck. "I don't feel any different." "Yeah, it's as if all the same energy is still here," Bill added, as he studied the clear surface of the lake. "But that means the gate's still open," Dylan said. "Does that mean that they can return?" Barb chewed at the end of one of her claws as her stomach rumbled hungrily. "I guess we just wait and see," Dylan answered. As they climbed from the wall, Bill stood for a moment and surveyed the lake for one last time and watched the swaying limbs of the distant trees beneath the green sky. He squinted with curiosity at a group of birds which crowded nearby in the branches of a magnolia. The birds resembled enormous black crows and seemed to be watching him with interest. Shrugging, he leapt down to follow the others. But before he did, he could have sworn he saw a glint of violet light shine in the eyes of the birds. If you've come this far, then thank you for listening to The Binding by me, Aaron Runyon. The Binding was one of the first books I ever tried to write about 10 years ago. It's kind of a love letter to some of my favorite fantasy horror. It's not the greatest book in the world, and there was a lot of mistakes. It was a very rough draft. But I always really liked the story, and I never did stop thinking about it. So, if you chose to listen, and I got to share it with you, then I hope hope you got something positive from the experience. If you're interested in reading it, you can find it at arcanastation.org. Otherwise, keep checking back, and there'll be some more stories. Thank you for your time. This is the Arcanist, Aaron F. Runyon, signing off.